Okay, so I'm a 16-year-old male, and I live in the suburbs on the East Coast in a town with a population of about 25,000 people. It was a normal night a couple years ago. I don't remember exactly what I was doing that night, except that I was on my way home when this happened. I was in the car with my dad and my little brother. My dad is an alcoholic and used to verbally and physically abuse my whole family. And as much as I'd love to divulge into the horror of my upbringing, this is the only detail relevant because even though my father is now sober, I'm still very uncomfortable around him. But my little brother was too young to remember much from when he was abusive and is much closer with him now. So, when we ride in the car, my brother sits in the front with my dad talking about whatever, and I sit in the back listening to music with my headphones, falling into my own thoughts while staring out the window. This night, while I was on my way home, was no different. I remember we were almost back, maybe about 5 minutes away, and we were coming up on passing a church, and I got immediate goosebumps when I laid my eyes on it. Then, I was rushed into an overwhelming feeling of terror and couldn't look away from the church as we grew nearer and nearer, fearing something bad would happen if I did. Now I listen to horror story narrations, read all kinds of things on Reddit, love horror movies, go to every haunted house in my area, and spend lots of time outside late at night when the weather permits it, going to the woods and abandoned places with my friends. So, this unexpected feeling of terror on a completely normal night, surrounded by what I knew as the safe place I grew up in, was very unusual. As we get closer to the church, I see two deer in front of its lawn. One is lying on its side and the other is standing, and it has its head bent towards the other's stomach. The deer on its side is dead, and the other deer has giant black horns that looked similar to the ones in the Marvel movie Thor Ragnarok. They were absolutely massive, and it looked like the deer shouldn't have been able to support their weight. I am frozen in fear when I realize the one is standing up is devouring the dead one, and as we passed by it, it looked up at me, straight in the eyes. It felt cold and angry, and I knew any intentions this thing had were, obviously, malicious. This is weird, but locking eyes with it almost made me feel like it knew me, like it stared into my soul and explored every nook and cranny in my brain. Thinking about that feeling still sends a shiver down my spine, because it was so unnatural, uncomfortable, and terrifying. But you could say that to describe everything about this creature. The skin had begun to rot off its face, and I could see part of its skull. It had sharp, shiny teeth and was covered in blood. My father and brother didn't notice anything, and I thought maybe I was seeing things. But that primal fear convinced me it was real, because I've never felt any kind of fear as real as what this felt like. I was truly scared for my life. In those few moments passing by, this thing I could feel its rage. It was almost tangible, and it felt awful. I knew that it wanted to kill anything or anyone, and it would do anything for the satisfaction. I believe me noticing its presence made me on its next immediate target list, which would explain why I was the only one affected by its presence. My father and brother both unalarmed enough to not even notice it. But thank God I was in the car when we passed it that night. The night went on as usual. I couldn't stop thinking about it though, so I went to the church the next day early in the morning and found the dead deer. All of its fur was skinned off, and it had a huge hole in it. Upon looking inside, I saw that its body was completely hollow. No blood, no organs, nothing. But it wasn't flat. It looks like everything was still intact, that it just died and had no fur. It was gone before the day was over. I still have no idea what happened that night, but I haven't seen anything similar since this, and I don't know if it was a skinwalker or not. All I know is it scared the hell out of me, and I hope to never see anything like it again. Okay, so I was about 14 at the time, and I grew up pretty poor. My mother at this time was really slowly disappearing from my life, and where I was later on homeless. But at this time, she was still around, and we were sleeping on the kitchen floor, as it was the comfiest floor in the house. I regularly get night terrors and sleep paralysis, but this time it felt different. I woke up immediately, feeling like I was being watched. I found it hard to breathe. I was just so terrified. Everything in my mind told me to not open my eyes, but being as curious as I am, I opened them anyway. What I saw I'll never forget. I saw this creature. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, but somehow fit into our small apartment hallway. Its bones were all deformed and broken, but it didn't look like it was in any pain. At this point, I had sat up and started to move backwards, away from this thing. It was all white and didn't have hair anywhere. There was something draining from its mouth when it would move nearer to me. I could hear this thing's bone cracking. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, but I could still hear it. I started actually screaming, and my mother woke up and yelled at me for my screaming, but I told her what was happening, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. My mother continues to insist I'm lying, but I swear what I saw that night was real, and it wasn't human. My name's Cody, and I'd been a paramedic about 5 years at the point that this story takes place. I originally joined the department to be a fireman, but after about a year, I'd realized that being a paramedic full-time was more enjoyable to me, and after discussion with my captain and a buttload of training, he agreed I could stay a paramedic as long as there were no manpower shortages elsewhere. Since then, I've spent every working day on a bus, doing the best job in the world, at least in my opinion. However, you're not reading this to hear my life story. Instead, you're here to read about one of the most horrific things I've ever seen on my job. The night it happened had been just like any other. There are occasional shifts where everything seems to go haywire, but those are rare, and we hadn't experienced one in quite some time. My normal shift was days, but I had been switched to nights after one of the old-timers had retired. Fortunately, I was riding with one of the only 2 guys I could stand. The rest of our crew was filled with jacked-up jocks and drama queens. That night I was working with Donald, probably the funniest guy in the department and my favorite guy to work with. Our first call of the night was a GSW in a rougher part of town. We arrived before the PD, and since our protocol was to never enter an active shooting situation, we were forced to sit and wait for them to arrive and clear the scene. After a very long 15 minutes, we were finally allowed to enter the apartment where the shooting had taken place. And, just as we had feared, the victim was already dead. And yes, I am aware that I started a paragraph saying this night was like any other. Unfortunately, things such as this are all too common in my city. Despite the rough start to the night, the calls that took place in the following few hours went far better. We managed to stabilize this poor little boy that was having an asthma attack. These things are often made worse by stressful situations, and the boy's mother was doing the poor kid no favors. Once we were able to get him alone in the bus, he responded much better to treatment. By the time we had arrived at the ER, the attack was all but over. That call was probably the highlight of the shift. Patients like that are the main reason I love my job so much. Helping others at times when they need it most gives me a supreme sense of achievement. There aren't many jobs that can do that for you anymore. The remainder of the calls that night went smoothly, mainly trip and falls and minor fender benders. All of them except the last. Stuff was winding down and we only had about an hour left. I was writing shotgun and going through the run sheets and double-checking them. We had just dropped off a drunk college girl that had been hit by a car full of more drunken college girls. None of the injuries were a big deal. After checking out all those involved in the incident, the driver and her passengers checked out fine, and the girl that was hit was left with appeared to be just a sprained ankle. Of course, the girl driving got to spend the night in jail. On the way out of the hospital parking lot, we received a call to meet the police department at the address of an elderly person for a wellness check. Generally, we didn't accompany the police on wellness checks, but since the citizen involved was diabetic and had a heart condition, we had been asked to tag along. Those of you reading this that are unaware of what a wellness check is, the police receive a call from a family member or a neighbor requesting the police to check on somebody to ascertain their situation. Basically, they ask the police to make sure their loved one is doing okay, living or not a danger to themselves, that kind of stuff. Anyway, we met the two officers outside the subject's apartment, who, in this case, was a 77-year-old widow who lived alone with an army of cats. As we stood outside the door waiting for somebody to open it, the faint smell of decomposition hung strong in the air of the cramped hallway. If the fact she didn't answer the door after 5 solid minutes of knocking was about enough, the smell of a decomposing body confirmed our darkest suspicions. Once the handyman returned with a key and let us in the apartment, the officers entered to secure the scene and determine the status of the subject of the check. In a matter of seconds, the younger of the two officers stormed back out into the hallway, retching uncontrollably. Donald and I shared a look of bewilderment. It had been quite a long time since I remember seeing a cop getting sick at a scene. I figured it had to be very bad in there, and I wasn't wrong. The second officer came out a few seconds later holding a handkerchief over his face and gave us the okay wave with his head. One step into the door, I was hit with an overbearing stench of cat pee, the universal perfume of the crazy cat lady. The smell came close to overpowering the decomposition, and the combination of the two made me a bit queasy. Donald went ahead of me while I put my bag down to dig out my flashlight. About that time, a cat zipped between my legs and out the door. I could only shake my head and hope I never ended up like this poor woman. I noticed Donald standing ahead of me, looking down at something with a horrified look on his face. A couch blocked whatever it was, but I could only assume it was the DB of the lady. His look did surprise me, considering we had both seen more than our share of corpses, and some of those had been beyond gnarly. I heard him mumble the words, "Dude, nasty," under his breath, and that only managed to make me even more curious. Just looked up at me and said, "You gotta see," and turned around and walked out of the room. He was shook in a way I'd never seen him, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but that was my job, so with a knot in my stomach, I walked down the hall and into the living area. When I walked past the couch, I slowly looked down and saw the most horrible sight I have ever, and hope will ever, see again. I reluctantly pulled out my flashlight and shone it down on her, so I could get a clearer look in the dark room. Her body had that deflated look and almost black color that corpses take on once they reached advanced decomposition. But that wasn't the bad part. From what I could tell, her face had been chewed up and eaten, but what I can only guess were the cats. She must have been dead for at least 2 or 3 weeks, and I assume when the cats ran out of food, they turned to the next option, her dead body. While I was crouched over her, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I stood up, stifling the taste of bile seeping into my mouth, and turned to look for what was causing it. As I scanned the dark room with my light, what seemed like hundreds of little red eyes peered back at me from dark corners under furniture. A chill slowly passed through me, and I ran from the room, back into the hall to call the coroner and animal control. Me and Donald stood in the hall with the 2 officers. We all shared a few shocked looks, but nothing was said until the coroner showed up. We made sure to warn him and his assistant about the state of her face, but unless you saw it for yourself, no one could really understand how horrid it looked. The 2 of them came out of the apartment just a few moments later, rolling her body on a gurney, and thank God it was in a bag. I just wasn't ready to see that again. All I can say is, I hope that poor lady was dead when those furry little monsters attacked her. Donald and I followed the coroner to his van, and once her body was loaded, I asked him point blank what he thought had happened. He looked me in the face almost nonchalantly. As far as I can tell, she had a cardiac event and was probably fed on by the cats. Her body's been in that apartment for at least a month, maybe longer considering it's winter and the heat wasn't on. The poor little things got hungry, and she was the only thing left to eat. The last thing I saw, those horrid creatures as were poor little things. He continued by saying that this was not his first time to come across something like this, and added that there had been a big story in the UK where something very similar had happened just recently. We pulled away from the scene about the time animal control showed up. I certainly did not envy those guys. From what I heard later, they spent the rest of the night in that cramped little place and ended up coming out there with 22 full-grown cats and a litter of kittens. I never found out if any of those little monsters were ever adopted out, but I know for sure I'll never let my kids bring home one, no matter how much they beg me. Hello, I'm a 21-year-old guy from Denmark. Back in 2017, I was going for a vacation road trip in the U.S. We started off in Las Vegas, where my mom visited and an old woman she lived with for a year, back when she was 16 and an exchange student. We then drove to L.A., then Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and finally, Louisiana. I was very into true scary stories, especially enjoy cryptid and unexplained creatures and skinwalkers and wendigos, and I told my family about it. But my sister and her boyfriend teased me about believing in such nonsense. My dad doesn't believe in God or superstitions or anything, but has some strange things that have happened to him, so he is a little more open-minded, which my mom also, because she have experienced paranormal stuff. When we were driving through the deserts of Arizona, my dad had to have a smoke, and we wanted to stretch our legs. We got out of the car, and my dad started smoking, and we looked around. Then suddenly my sister says, "What is that?" and pointed towards the desert, where we immediately noticed a lion-sized, totally black cat. Like it was so black that it absorbed the light. It was just walking. It had a really long and thick tail, and it walked so freaking weird, like it was a robot, just totally stiff legs. Then it noticed us and just froze, and turned its head really fast, and just stared. Then I turned its body without moving its head, and started walking our direction. Then I said that we should probably get in the car and get moving, because I wasn't staying around for it to reach us. My family quickly agreed, and we hurried to get in the car and take off. For the rest of the trip, my sister's boyfriend and my sister didn't tease me about any unexplainable creatures anymore. We were really agitated by this thing. I started Googling and searching about animals that live in Arizona, and I couldn't find anything about a big-ass feline that was black anywhere in the world. The only big cats I could find were jaguars, and it's rare they get black and not that black. It was also much larger than a jaguar. And jaguars, cougars, and mountain lions live in forested areas, and definitely not in the middle of dirt or cacti. I still think about this a lot, and I've never found an answer to what this exactly was. And I believe even more now that there are creatures of this world we don't know about. February 15th. I was walking back home after hanging out with some friends of mine. Before anyone asks me, I was completely sober and in my right mind. I have never been afraid to walk alone in the dark. I'm quite tall and intimidating looking from a distance, and I always bring a pocket knife when I know I'll be walking alone in the dark. Anyway, I was walking past some woods on the way back to my house, and I heard my mother's voice call, "Gabriel, help!" from inside the woods. I immediately recognized her voice and turned to look into the woods. She kept calling my name over and over, but I couldn't see anything. It was far too dark to see through the trees. "Mom!" I called back, heading towards the woods. She sounded like she was in trouble and scared. I assumed that she had gone for a run like she did every night and somehow got lost in the woods. Then I realized it couldn't be her. She had texted me only 10 minutes before, asking me to come home soon to watch my little sister so she could go on a run. I stopped dead in my tracks and called my mom. The voice in the woods still calling my name and getting more frantic by the second. She picked up and I immediately asked her if she was in the woods. She said no. She was back home with my little sister. I swear to God, as soon as she said she was back home, her voice stopped calling my name from inside the woods. I was overcome with a wave of dread and fear that I had never felt before. Something in the woods was trying to lure me in, using my mother's voice, and it knew my full name, not just my nickname, which made things even scarier because the only person who calls me Gabriel is my mother. I immediately turned and ran faster than I had ever ran before back home. When I got back home, my legs felt like jello and my legs burnt. I opened the door and there was my mom sitting on the couch with my sister. I would think this is some sort of prank, but my mom isn't one for pranks. And even if she was, there's no way she could have gotten home before me without me seeing her. Hello, I am a male in my early 20s, and I live in South Dakota, and I am an experienced Wiccan. I haven't had too many bad experiences, but there is one I can remember. There was one ritual I was wanting to try, but I need more than just me to perform it. So I invited one of my friends to help me with it, because I knew she had been wanting to learn a little bit more from somebody experienced. Just for reference, my friend was a couple years younger than me, and she was a small, patient girl with colored short hair. So I set up a night at a local lake to perform this ritual. And I want to point out that this ritual wasn't exactly a good magic type of ritual. It wasn't dark magic by any means, but more of an in-between type of magic. So me and my friend set up a night and met at the location we had discussed. I told her what to expect and what to do. I told her that she had to do everything that I explained, or that the ritual was for nothing. So she agreed, and we began the ritual. I started by lighting a small fire and set my makeshift cauldron into the center of it. I threw the first few ingredients into the cauldron, and we started. The first quarter of our ceremony went by pretty quickly, and then I heard a bush behind me moving, and I thought it was just a small creature moving on by. So I ignored it, and we reached about halfway through the ceremony, and I heard a louder sound like branch snapping, so I was a little more nervous about my surroundings and who or what was possibly watching us. After the second interruption, I kind of sped up the process and tried to get our ritual done. After the next hour or so, I kept hearing whispers behind me, and off in the distance in the dark in front of me. At this point, my friend was starting to hear things too, and she was starting to get uncomfortable, since she wasn't as comfortable with everything as I let her just sit in front of the fire with me behind her. As she was reading out of my book of shadows, I felt someone watching us, so I told my friend to add 3 decent-sized logs to the fire to try to make it easier to see. After a few minutes, the logs finally caught on fire and lit up about 50 more yards around us, revealing a tall, slender figure just on the outside of the light of our fire. Just as I noticed the figure, so did my friend. She began shaking and she called my name without moving. She asked, "What do we do?" I told her, "Don't move. All we have to do is say a short invocation, close the book, and put out the fire." By then, the figure had glowing red eyes, and I could finally see a ragged black cloak draped over the figure with long, slender arms that were nothing but bone. Before it had the chance to move, I shouted the final words of the invocation and closed the ritual circle. My friend slammed the book shut, and I kicked sand onto the fire, extinguishing the flames. Just as the flames went out, the creature made an ear-piercing screech that seemed like it shook the whole ground. My friend was lying on the ground, covering her ears, starting to cry. I picked her up and booked it for my vehicle that was parked about 200 yards behind us, hidden behind a large row of trees. As soon as I got to my car, I threw open the driver's side door and put my friend in on the bench seat and slid her over to the passenger side. I got in, slammed the door shut. I started my vehicle and I floored it out of the trees that we were in. But just as we got into the clearing, on the outside of the trees, the figure was floating there, about 100 yards in front of my vehicle. I didn't move. I looked over at my friend, and she was still curled up in a ball crying. I didn't want this thing to hurt her, so I looked back at it, and as soon as it did, it made the same defining scream. I put my car in first gear and floored the gas pedal to get out of there. I didn't care if I hit it, I just wanted to leave. But just as I was about to hit it, it vanished into the fog. I didn't look back, I just kept driving. We had about 5 miles before we hit pavement and were able to drive faster. It was about another 25 minutes back in the town, and on the way back, my friend never said a word. I asked her if she was okay, and she just looked at me. By the time we got back into town, my friend did admit that she knew why everything happened. Apparently, her ex-boyfriend had gone to some voodoo doctor, asking him to set a dark spirit to hurt or even kill her because he was jealous of her spending so much time with me. At the end of all of this, she did become my girlfriend, and we haven't tried any new rituals for quite some time now.